I started to understand if I was going to be good at leading people, I needed to become a student of leadership. It's a continuous journey. I'm still learning to be better and becoming really good at leading people, whether I'm leading a big team or leading up. And so really understanding I have to learn everything I can about this and figure out how to apply it.
Today, I'm joined by General Shawn Campbell. General Campbell played a key role in standing up the U.S. Space Force. He also led in developing human capital strategy across the Air Force and the Pentagon. General Campbell is the author of The Mission of Leadership, a book focused on character, courage, and leadership. Let's get into it.
This is Kobeck on Air. CEO and co-founder Hisham built a workplace that people trust. Now he's interviewing other people-first leaders to explore what shapes them. Today's episode of Kobeck on Air is brought to you by Kobeck. We help organizations improve processes, decision-making, and performance. Stay tuned for more.
All right. Well, welcome to the show, General Shawn Campbell, retired General Shawn Campbell from the Air Force. It's an honor to have you. Thank you very much.
No, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
You are our first general that we've interviewed. Now, granted, maybe the first person. No, that's not true. We've interviewed other people who were in the service, but no one as high ranking as you. So it's an honor. And thank you for your service. Now, I did read your book. You're also the author of this book.
Yes.
The Mission of Leadership. I highly recommend it. It's a quick, easy read, very people-oriented, people-focused, lots of easy to understand tips that are just kind of straightforward. I think sometimes, people think that leadership is this overcomplicated thing. While it is difficult, it is to me kind of a simple concept, but pulling it off and doing the right things in that situation is actually the hard part. And you do a good job explaining that.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah. And that was part of the goal, was to make this very readable. I didn't want to create a textbook. There's any number of different leadership theories and ways to do it. This is just an approach. And really what I tried to do is just share basic principles and give some practical examples of what that looked like for me, what I learned, where I failed, how I learned from that failure, where I felt like I did things well. And so it's less of a roadmap with respect to, XYZ, do all of these things and you will be successful. It was more of a, here's just what I learned, leading teams as small as 3 and as large as 3,000 across the planet. And, managing billions of dollars in assets and people and that sort of thing. And so I appreciate that. It was just trying to distill it in a way that you could read in one sitting and you could learn maybe a few things, or maybe hone some of your own skills and experience and just improve, because I think leadership is a continuous journey. I don't think you ever really arrive.
100%. I'm always reading. I prefer audiobooks, but I don't know if I know how to read, actually. I realized that recently, but no, I'm always learning. And I think it's well said that you never get there. I don't know if there's anybody that's an expert. Maybe someone has experience or has read a lot about it, but to officially be an expert, I think is pretty hard to attain. And that's maybe the goal, right? Is to continuously learn. Tell me about the book in the sense of, I've never wrote a book. Is this something you always thought you were going to do, and thus you kept sort of like a memoir or notes, or did you sit down one day and say, hey, you know what, I'm going to write a book?
None of the above. Really what happened is I hadn't really thought about writing a book until probably 7 or 8 years ago. And my wife encouraged me to write down some of the stories, the things that I did wearing the uniform for 30 years and all the different places that I'd been and some of the things that I picked up along the way. And I didn't really like the idea of writing something that was more autobiographical, because while I was very honored to have the career I had in the U.S. Air Force, I wouldn't consider myself someone famous or well-known. I'm not one of those generals like a MacArthur or a Patton or somebody that would be a household name, where people would be really interested in learning, okay, where did this person grow up and what were their formative experiences and all of the exploits, and I mean that in a positive way, that they had in their career. And so when my wife started encouraging me to think through some of the things that I had done, it was really more of a, how can I tell some of the stories about experiences that I had that would be meaningful, most importantly, to my children, to our children who grew up in this life that they didn't ask for. And so, as I say in the book, they were front row action figures to this life. And so it was a way for me to say, here's the things that you didn't realize I was doing. And yes, I again, I don't go into depth and detail about every single assignment I had, but I share stories, and the kids were connected to some of those. And so it was a way for me to capture some of those ideas and those experiences and put it to print. And then I determined that writing was a difficult process. I'm not one of those who knew I could sit down at the keyboard and just write for hours on end. And so I actually worked with a partner to help me write through this. While this is all my own work, what that partner helped me do was very similar to what we're doing here today. He more or less interviewed me over a series of hours, and then he had captured all of the things that we talked about. Now, ahead of time, we had drafted a very detailed way of how we were going to roadmap through this book. And so we knew what the different chapters were going to be. We changed the titles a little bit along the way, but we generally knew the flow and the format. And so I had given, which is not at all uncommon in the US military, I had given a series of oral histories for a couple of assignments where I had senior leader positions. And I liked that way of doing it. It was a great way to have this dialogue back and forth and really sharpen the syntax and the stories we were telling and working back and forth in an iterative way. It allowed us to move with a lot more speed than if I had sat down and tried to do it entirely on my own without an accomplished author that I worked with to help me really tell those stories and to do so in a way that was relatable, as you started with at the top, in a way that would be eminently digestible, that it didn't feel like I'm in class, I'm reading a textbook, and it's not that the material itself is without heft. It's that you can read it, understand it, and apply it for yourself if that's something that resonated with you. One of the things that I share in the book, any of the different things that we cover. And so it was a way for me to move with a lot more speed. I think we did the entire thing in the space of just a handful of weeks. Now, that was before we went through copy editing and all of the back and forth, but getting the main manuscript on paper only took us a few weeks. And so it was a really great way for me to be able to do that because like you, I'm a very busy person. And so the idea was I didn't want to be trying to write this at 10 o'clock at night or midnight or 5 o'clock in the morning when I had actual time to sit down and do it. So I just carved out a couple of hours each week for a series of weeks. And then we were able to get through to what you read.
Yeah. Again, great book. Where can we buy this?
You can get it on Amazon. And right now you can get the e-reader version. So the Kindle version, you can get the paperback. The hardcover was supposed to be released at the same time that was released on 11 November 2025. They're still working on that. And then we finished the audiobook recording last week. So our goal is to have that available. If we get it done before Christmas, that would be wonderful. I think we're targeting the 15th. So about 2 weeks from now of our recording, 15th of December, for us to be able to get that finalized. And then that will also be available on Amazon. So you'll have the 4 different formats.
That's great. You mentioned your wife. You talk about your wife a lot in the book, which is lovely. You're talking about your kids and essentially the book being a way to kind of continue your legacy and share your thoughts and your experiences. So let's go back a little bit in your life. Where did you grow up? Where are you from?
I'm originally from Buffalo, New York. And when I was in high school, I was a sophomore in high school, my father moved us to Virginia Beach, where I wanted to go into high school. And my father, gratefully, is still alive, still lives in Virginia Beach. And I asked him, so why are we moving from Buffalo? I mean, I'm born and raised, and I'd never known anything but Western New York. I mean, other than traveling a little bit, right? And he said, well, there's 2 reasons. One, I'm tired of snow, and I'm tired of the taxes in New York State. At 15, I understood the snow. I didn't have any real inclination what the whole tax thing was about, but I learned that later. But yeah, I'm originally from Buffalo, New York, which I often tell people I'm a long-suffering Buffalo Bills fan. Maybe one day they'll win the Super Bowl and then I can die, kind of happy. Not immediately after if it's this year, but it's been a tough time being a Bills fan my entire life.
I don't feel bad for you. I'm a Commanders fan.
Well,
I think it's worse for us.
right. Well, at least you have, I think, 3 Super Bowls in
Yeah.
your history, championship wins, one over Buffalo. And
True.
so At least you
Ancient
can say,
history. Ancient
right? It is
history.
a little dated, right? It is a little dated
And you have
for sure.
Josh
But
Allen. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, but I hear you. I get it. I get it. It's but at least you have the right guy. I think you guys will be fine.
we'll see.
So keep going. So you grew up
Yeah.
in an area. Talk to me about your high school years.
Yeah. So when we moved to Virginia Beach, it was interesting. It was kind of a fish out of water because I'd grown up in Western New York as I shared, and coming to Virginia Beach, which is a really interesting place because I didn't know anything about surfing. And at that time in the 80s, skating was starting to boom. It was becoming this big thing. And so you had the skate parks with the half pipes and all of that sort of stuff. And I was not coordinated enough to either be on a skateboard, or I never figured out how to get on a surfboard. And so there was this sort of cultural clash, which I think helped me as I started that Air Force career, and understanding that there are just regional differences. We're still America, but there are things that are just different. And it's not a good or a bad. It's just starting to understand different contexts and how people live, and the different sorts of environments that they're in, and how to adjust to being in a new place and being somebody that grew up in a very different way of thinking. And coming to Virginia Beach was a little bit like going to a different planet. And it's, again, not good or bad. It just was, oh wow, okay, there's different norms here in this area that I don't understand. And even things like the terminology, the slang that surfers used, and that's not a pejorative. It's just I didn't understand what it's like. This is a whole nother language. We don't have this in Buffalo. And even the way that I spoke was different, different words. And so starting to think through that. And then I started college here, pretty pedestrian. I went to the local community college, and then I transferred to a 4-year university out of there, actually to Old Dominion University, which is where both of my kids graduated towards the end of my Air Force career. And I realized after my junior year of college, I didn't have any resources left in terms of, okay, I had scholarship for a couple of years that went away, and just my savings and what I had available for school, it wasn't looking good. And I was one of 5 kids. And so I was looking at my dad, and he's like, I'll sign loans for school. And I didn't feel right about that. There has to be a different way for me to finish what was essentially about a year and a half of my undergraduate without you being on the hook for maybe me indebting you if I wind up being not really good at something whenever I graduate. And so my roommate at the time was in the U.S. Navy. I said, I'm thinking about this military thing. You have the GI Bill, you have these opportunities. Maybe I'll go learn a skill. I'll get some additional experience. I'll come home after my 4-year contract is up, and I'll go back to Old Dominion University and finish out. And then my plan was to go be a private sector executive. That I had a goal to eventually get to that level. So I enlisted in the Air Force. I wound up serving as an enlisted member for about 2.5 years, and I got my commission as a second lieutenant. And then I spent the next almost 27 years as an officer. And as you opened, I finished in the general officer ranks, which was something I hadn't ever thought I would do. I mean, my plan was to do 4 years, come home, and thank you for the opportunity. And it wound up being a 30-year, 2-month, and 8-day career in uniform. So it was very unexpected. And you mentioned my wife. It's partly why I talk about her, is that we were dating when I left for the Air Force. We met when we were 19 years old. So I usually say it that she raised our 2 kids and me because, my prefrontal cortex maybe still hasn't closed at this point, and she's still trying to help me. And she was remarkably supportive from the day I said, I think I'm going to join the Air Force. I'm going to go off and try this military thing. And then I left. We got engaged a few months after I left for the Air Force. And then we got married about a year after I had started my Air Force career. So it is correct to say she was there from the very beginning through the very end, which, again, she encouraged me to tell these stories. And that's why I mention her several times in the book, because she was there for every single part of that, every place we moved, and including the 13 different assignments we had, the 17 different homes that she lived in, because we moved a couple of different times in those assignments to different homes, the same location, but different homes. When we retired from the Air Force and we moved home to the Hampton Roads area of Virginia, the 18th move was when we bought our house and moved in here. And so she was there for all of that. But that was it. I sometimes say it was kind of an accidental career. It was a means to an end. It was a way for me to finish paying for college, and it wound up being a full career that I just could not have expected or anticipated. It would take me to all the different places it took me all over the planet, many places that I'm going to be okay with not going back to. you can you can appreciate, but yeah, I mean that was sort of my story in a shell without getting into all of those details. But it was just a way for me to finish paying for college, and it wound up being a career. It's amazing.
It's funny that I think I hear that a lot. I mean, I think I'm in the same way where people think they have a plan in life, but or sometimes they don't have a plan in life, right? But it's not, but they end up somewhere. I think that happens more than, I mean, I think you can argue for some jobs, like, I guess a doctor, if you're going to go on to become a surgeon, sometimes, that path is pretty clear for a while at least, but you never really know where it's going to go. And I think I remember, being in college and I didn't know what I wanted to do necessarily either. And I don't know that's always a bad thing. I mean, there was a couple kids that are like, I want to do this from high school. And I'm like, how do you know that already? I mean, good for you. But I didn't know. I think people may have a certain purpose or calling or finding their why and stuff like that they need to do. But where they end up is never really where you really expect. So it's interesting. I don't know, just a reflection point. I was just thinking about it. I was like, but now let me ask you this. So
Sure.
Then what kept you in the service?
This is a great question. And I think sometimes there's this assumption that it was all about patriotic duty. Like that's why I joined, which is why I said, no, it was really means to an end. What for me, it was just, I understood there would be a way for me to finish paying for college so that I wouldn't go into debt or put my father in debt. And what kept me was I loved the work. And I realized how resonant it was with me. I'm a very structured person. I enjoyed the discipline. This is not like, ancient Sparta. I don't mean to say it was like King Leonidas or something like that, but it really, it really spoke to me in a way that made sense. And I think I learned pretty early on that this is a place where I can thrive. I understand it. It makes logical sense to me. And I think I'm pretty good at what I'm doing here. And the biggest reason was one opportunity after another opened for me. And as I share in the book, I'm a person of specific faith. And I thought that those doors were opened for me providentially. And so I walked the path that was before me. And I walked it right through the end when my wife and I knew it was time for us to hang up the uniform and move on to that next chapter. That's why I stayed. I loved the work. I loved the idea of, even though I didn't start there, I was doing something that was worthwhile. That, borrowing from Teddy Roosevelt's Man in the Arena speech, I was a person in the arena and I wanted to be a part of that. And I knew what we were doing was really important. And not just for the nation, but globally, the impacts that we were having, not always super positive. And, I'm not trying to relitigate the bad parts of our history, but I recognized that what I was doing had value and I wanted to be a part of that. And as we often say for people who do 4 or 40 years in the military, when you leave, the military won't miss you. The men and women will miss you, but the military mission will go on. And so I recognized this was my part of it. It was part of my journey. And as you read, as I closed the book with I share my retirement speech, and I say that, the end of my watch has come, and I cede the watch. It's time for me to pass it on to the next generation. And so really that was it. It was a love of the work that I was doing and understanding it had value. And that's what kept me.
Awesome. So let's talk about when did you start getting into leadership? At what age, what part of your career, and what was it again, kind of just happened. And then again, you were like, hey, I like this, or how did it go down?
I would love to tell you that there was a defining moment where the light bulb went on and I knew, hey, I'm a leader and I'm in this. It was not accidental. It was more of when you're a young officer in particular, or you become a young non-commissioned officer in the military, you're put in charge of people. Now, I don't know very many, great many places where at 22 or 23, suddenly you're responsible for a half a dozen people, and in some circumstances for us as young leaders in the military context, millions of dollars worth of people and assets. It's like I
Right.
don't know where else that is. But it was impressed upon me from very early on in my Air Force career. In fact, my very first assignment. So I finished basic training. I go through my technical training program. Those two schoolhouses together were about 10 months. I get to my first assignment. My very first supervisor challenged me. His name was Todd Noy. And what he said to me is, "Why are you here?" Because remember, I was a little older than the traditional enlistee because I'd been at school for several years. And so I was a little more seasoned. I'd been out on my own. And so I wasn't just, an 18-year-old kid who joined the military directly from, their home. And he wasn't poking at me. He was trying to light a fire underneath me. Say, there are other things that you can do in our Air Force. Are you interested in going to officer training school and leading people as an officer? You could do that as an enlisted member. I don't mean to suggest that isn't the case. And that's what he pushed me towards in a positive way. And then I started to understand if I was going to be good at leading people, I needed to become a student of leadership. And so I don't know where along the way, maybe now I'm a good leader. As we spoke about a few minutes ago, it's a continuous journey. I'm still learning to be better and becoming more conditioned to be really good at leading people, whether I'm leading a big team or I'm leading horizontally other teammates across the organization I'm working in, or leading up. And so really understanding I have to learn everything I can about this and figure out how to apply it. And so as you shared, I've read volumes and volumes and volumes from some of the best leaders in history, whether they're military leader or a business leader, or those who are really adept at leaning in, learning, and leading others, what that looks like. And so for me, I just recognized I owe it to the men and women around me to learn how to become a better leader. And as I share in the book, I made a ton of mistakes along the way where I thought I was doing the right thing and I really wasn't. And those lessons helped me sharpen my thinking about what better looks like. I want to be careful not to say what right looks like, but what better looks like, because that would presume that everything I've done or do as a leader is the right model for doing it, as opposed to it's an approach that works for me. And last thing, and I'll pause, is I also had to understand where my limits were. What are the things I am really good at doing? What are the things I need to learn to do better? And where are the areas where I'm probably not going to be the expert or the experienced person in the room? And how do I find the people who are, and then really engage them and energize them to be the ones that step forward in those areas? And this as an executive, you can't know everything about everything. And that's where we get into trouble, is if we believe that we are capable of doing everything. So it was really just a continuous leadership learning journey is maybe the best way for me to summarize that.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I know much about anything, or maybe I should say I know a little about a lot. Maybe that's probably more. That's what happens, right? I mean, as
Right.
you get higher up in companies or
Right.
any organization, you start to see more or be involved in a little bit more,
Correct.
but you don't really know any of it all that well. And so
Right.
you really do rely on the team, right? I mean, that's really
That's right.
that's what you're there for, is to
That's right.
support them. So you sounds like, you're I think our fifth or so guest. One of the common themes, I think you'd be interested in hearing this, because you have this as well, is self-awareness.
Mhm.
I think it's a pretty important thing to have. I mean, you said, I realized I needed to continue to learn. I need to learn about doing this, and that I don't know everything, that I need to know, certain things about people so I can help them, and so on. That's a very important trait. I think sometimes people can I would imagine this probably is an expectation in the military as well, where as you get higher up in ranks, people assume you know things, and maybe it's harder to even ask a question. But you feel that, right? You could be in a room with a bunch of other generals or high-ranking executives or military people, and you're like, I don't actually know the basic of whatever this is, and sometimes people are afraid to ask that, but there's probably it's probably a different culture maybe in the military, but there's probably a way to do that without making yourself look bad and actually helping others because somebody else probably doesn't know the answer as well, right?
It's really an interesting topic because I think it's like any other team. There are experiences that I had in the military with leadership teams where what you just described was highly encouraged. Ask questions. We are going to be better if we are asking questions of one another, particularly if you're in that executive leader level, because the breadth and depth of the things for which you're responsible are so vast. The likelihood that you're the most intelligent or learned person in the room about every single subject, that's simply not going to be the case. And so most of the military teams I worked on, particularly in those executive levels, were inquisitive, encouraged that kind of dialogue and discussion, and sometimes debate. Not always, but most of the time. But it did help me think through this idea of how am I modeling that for the teams around me? Do they recognize that I value what they have to say? And you know this from your own experience that one of the worst ways for a leader, no matter where you are in an organization, to really discourage that dialogue and that debate and that discussion is to state your position up front. Here's what I think. Now, what do you guys think? As opposed to let the conversation flow. At some point, the person that's at the head of the table, as it were, has to make a decision. But how do you engage people and encourage them to have that dialogue with you? And also recognizing that not everybody in the room is going to feel comfortable doing that. And so recognizing those men and women who probably have something really introspective to share, but they won't in that form. Perhaps it's fear, or the uncertainty or the doubt of, if I say this thing, is it going to come off sounding like I'm sort of idiotic and maybe I shouldn't be? But no, I encourage that kind of conversation. And so it was something that I worked on deliberately with my teams and told them up front, look, I don't have all the answers. A quick story, when I got promoted to the general ranks, what you just described happened. So I was having this conversation with a 4-star general, and I'm a 1-star. I'm new, and we're about 6 months into this new rank, and he just asked me one day, "How's it going?" And I thought, because it was at the time that I was helping build the U.S. Space Force, he was asking me how that was going, which is a fascinating. Maybe I'll write another book about that one day. But that was a fascinating time, and I realized I didn't know all that much about space when I got the call to go to support building the Space Force. And so it was way outside my comfort zone. I understood how to lead people. I understood human resources. I understood dynamics in the Pentagon and how to make those things work. But I didn't know the first thing about the space environment, the space domain. And so that's really what he was asking me. And I remember telling him, well, sir, I feel like I'm a brand new second lieutenant. So I'm starting all over again at the bottom rank in the military because I'm this new general and people expect me to have answers. I often have no answer because I don't even know what they're talking about in some of these meetings. Again, I know how to lead teams and develop people and do learning and development and skills management, all that sort of thing, and how to budget. But when you start with the space terminology and you're having these conversations, and I'm responsible in part for helping develop space guardians to do the work. And I don't even know what Kepler's law is, but I keep hearing it in these conversations. And so it was me like leaning in, and he said, well, I've been a general for 10 years and I still don't have all the answers. So it
Oh,
was a
good.
really, self-effacing, deprecating way to say, we don't expect you to have all the answers. But what he was challenging me to do, and I knew him well enough to know what he was getting at, which is what we've just talked about. You need to dig in and continuously learn. You need to learn more about this craft. No one is going to expect you to understand astrophysics in 6 months, but
Right.
just the general dynamics of how the domain works and the different kinds of orbits that we have and those sorts of principles, so that when you're in these engagements, you can speak intelligently. The other part of that story that I shared with him was, I said, it's an interesting thing because the week before I put on my star for the first time, I'm in the routine weekly staff meeting. I'm there representing my 3-star boss. Nobody asked me a question. The next week, I'm now promoted. I'm wearing the new rank. Now they stop and ask me my opinion about what was happening. And I thought, that's interesting. I'm the same human 7 days ago that I am today. The only difference is what I'm wearing on my shoulders. And so now all of a sudden, you're interested in what I might have to say about this. That's really interesting. I didn't suddenly become, funneled full of
Mm-hmm.
information in that 7-day space. And now I know everything that I could possibly know about space operations in the domain. It was just interesting, right? Just
Oh yeah.
that little change, and suddenly there's this different way of people experiencing or engaging you. And like, well, I'm the same human. I don't know how much more now than I did 7 days ago, but thank you for asking.
There's a story that, do you know Simon Sinek?
Of course, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. I've listened to a lot of his stuff. He's great. One of the stories he tells is similar, where there was somebody from the military, a general or something, where he was giving a speech somewhere, and he retired, came the next year, and he started his speech basically by saying, I was here the year before. I was flown in, whatever, private, first class. I got asked for a coffee. I got this nice mug with a latte. And now he holds up like a styrofoam cup, and he's like, I took an Uber here and I have this cup. And it's basically like the respect was actually to the title versus the person. It's kind of what you're talking about. It's not so much the respect, but it's interesting how people do treat people differently based on their title. But yeah, but you're the same person, right? And that goes back to what you were saying, where, how do you pull the other person's, somebody in the room who doesn't say that much, maybe doesn't have a high title. Well, they still matter, right? And their opinion could actually be the most important one, right? But you haven't heard it, so you got to be able to pull that out. And honestly, something I'm working on as leader is not talking a lot and waiting till the end. I'm not very good at it. Sometimes I work on it. I've noticed when I try it, it comes out of nowhere, and people are like, "Is everything okay? Why didn't he say anything?" And I'm like, "No, I'm just trying not to talk. Let you guys talk." But no, I mean, these are all again, I'm still learning myself, right? I'm not perfect, that's for sure. But yeah, that's interesting. You had that same kind of experience with your title change and position
Absolutely.
change.
And I've heard this many times. That's why, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth.
Mm-hmm.
You should be listening twice as much as you're speaking, and also understanding it's okay not to fill the void. There's often that lull in the conversation in the conference room or on the shop floor or in the manufacturing spaces or whatever it is. You don't need to fill the void. Sometimes a little bit of silence is okay. It feels awkward, but that might be that moment that it gives that person that you want to really hear from to say, now's my opportunity to step in here. And so that's really important. It's often what you don't say as a leader that has the most impact. And also recognizing that idea of psychological safety, which I know is sort of ubiquitous. Maybe it's starting to become trite where everybody tosses that out. And good on Dr. Amy Edmondson for coining the phrase a number of years ago. But she was really giving voice to things that I think many of us who have longer careers recognize is really what you're talking about, is giving people the opportunity and the opening to say what they're thinking and not to belittle them or to create an environment where they don't have the confidence that what I am thinking actually matters in this room. But there's another piece to that where leaders who are really adept at opening that dialogue and giving those opportunities also have to be willing to change their mind. So if I say, you can say whatever you want to me and we can have this exchange, we can have this dialogue, but if the leader or the decision maker at any level has already pre-baked the decision, you're not really listening. And at some point, the teammates around you will know that. They'll say, well, you give great voice to this, but we never see you change your mind. We never hear you acknowledge, that's a great idea. Let's do it that way. As opposed to, here's how we're going to do this. And there's a little bit of a slippery slope there also. I tried desperately. I didn't always get it right, but I tried desperately, and I still do, to attribute the idea to whoever came up with it, rather than say, and we've been in these meetings where maybe you're working with a different level executive and you come in with a series of recommendations and they accept those recommendations. That's great. That's great work. Thanks for bringing it in. Now, sometimes you don't have the opportunity to say, well, it really wasn't my idea. It was the team's idea. And others might feel like you're just, demurring and trying to say that. But the reality is that to the extent that I could it was important to say, hey, that was Johnny's idea or Jane's idea. It was not mine. They brought it in. I thought that seems to be the right way to go. And so to give that attribution, which is something I learned, and it's not just military centric, but it's really important because when people know that you're acknowledging what they're bringing, even if it's a small thing, that's something that I think of as a moment that matters. I attributed it to that human. They know that I'm adopting what they have provided or presented, and it really gives them additional confidence. And they know that I mean what I say, that my actions are followed up. My words are being followed up by the actions that I take in supporting that. And even now when I write posts and that sort of thing, I attribute ideas to others. I often have said, and people who know me well know this, I often said, I've never had an original idea. Everything has come from somewhere else. And I'm simply adopting that. And in some cases, adapting it to my own style. But there's so much goodness in learning from others, and no matter where they are in the organization. I've told a number of stories about people who were technically subordinate to me in the military where they've come in with really good ideas, and like, that's great. You just taught me something. And you mentioned this earlier. So, those people aren't necessarily in leadership positions where their name is on the door outside the office, but they have that amazing influence and impact inside the organization. And one of the things I tried to do for many years was go find those humans. Who are the people who are really making things work here? Because it's probably not the person who has the nice office at the corner. There's somebody else in this organization or this business unit, for example, who's the real impetus behind the goodness that's coming out of this BU. And so I'm going to go find that human. And
how do you do that?
Say.
I'm curious, how do you do that, especially in a very large organization?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're there with everybody, it's like, oh, well, that person's amazing. But what are some ways to try to dig and find that person in a larger organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a couple of ways that I would recommend doing that. One of those is, and I don't mean to use the old management by walking around example, but that's part of it. As a leader, you should spend far and away more time out in your organization than behind your desk. And that's tricky, right? Because especially as you move up and you become an executive, and I mean, you don't own your calendar anymore. You're going with whatever shows up on your day, but being deliberate to carve time. I used to tell my executive assistants, and it drove one of them in particular when I was at the U.S. Air Force Academy insane. I would say, okay, I'm going walkabout, which is, my way of borrowing that Australian term, saying I'm getting in my staff car and I'm going to go drive around the academy, and I'm going to poke in different parts of the organization and just talk to people. And she would never know where I was going because I didn't want her to call and say, hey, the boss is heading your way.
Right.
Because then it's the whole, okay, dust everything off real quickly and sweep the front stoop and whatever and make it.
Yeah.
No, I don't want that. I'm going to show up in places so I can hear voices and just talk to people, not to be obstructive, but to just be deliberate about going out and talking to people and hearing things. A quick example was one of the assignments I had when I was outside of St. Louis. I walked into the shop where all the base plumbers work, and they worked for me, down line. And I just walked in and started asking questions. And there was one particular non-commissioned officer in there who asked me some very pointed questions, and I recognized this is somebody I want to talk to again. And how do I highlight that? Because he's asking not only insightful questions, he's giving really thoughtful responses to the questions that I'm asking, which tells me he's not just trying to stroke my ego or say, hey, sir, it's great to see you. No, he was engaging me, which told me something about that particular human. And I brought that back to his boss, who's a couple layers up from him, and said, I want to talk to that young man again. And he has some really interesting ideas, and I want to borrow some of the things he's sharing because I think they're good practices for the rest of our 1,500 person organization. And so that's a piece of it. And the other piece of it, particularly when you're in really large organizations, is who are those connective conduits? Who are those people that you're working with where I would say, hey, I want to hear the good news stories. Tell me what's going on inside your organization and highlight people for me. And I think of like when Jeff Bezos was still running Amazon and he would have those quarterly calls with everybody in Amazon. And I know other CEOs do that. I mean, various organizations that I work in now, we have those routine connections as well, but they're asking those stories. Tell me about the people who I'll call them the movers and shakers inside your organization. And one of the ways that I approached that was when I would have those quarterly all calls, I would highlight usually 3 people from various parts of the organization. And normally they didn't even know it was going to happen. Now,
Yeah.
they had a leader in the unit that knew that that was going to happen, but that human didn't know it. All of a sudden they're sitting I'll use the Air Force Academy as an example. They're sitting in a room with 1,000 other humans and they see their picture pop up on the screen. They have no idea what's going on. And then I tell a 2 to 3 minute story about some of the great things that human is doing for our organization or has done for our organization. And it changes the dynamic because people recognize, the boss is paying attention, and they might be 4, 5, 6 layers up from me, but they just popped my picture up and told some things about me I didn't know they knew. And
Hmm.
so it was a way in a large organization, I had 3,000 people in that organization, to collapse that close. So people recognized I was paying attention to their stories and I was hearing that and sorting through those. And obviously I couldn't speak about all 3,000 people every quarter, but that was a way to do it. So it was twofold. It was being out and about, engaging people directly, and then secondarily listening through those different business unit leaders, the stories of the men and women who are making a difference inside their part of the organization, and then highlighting that in front of the entire organization. Those are game changers. Those young men and women, or even some of them who are more seasoned in life to me, like, wow, that's amazing. You know my story. And I would routinely get like an email, or they would stop me after the session and say, I didn't even know you knew that. I'm like, well, I do. And thank you. And that mattered to people.
That's amazing. I think I remember that from the book. I also remember, because it was last week when I read it. But I think you talk about handwriting sort of thank you and
Mhm.
acknowledgement notes.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool in today's world, right? I mean, even if this was a few years ago, I'd say any time in the past 20 years, it's probably an accomplishment.
Yes.
So is that something? Tell me about that. I mean, is that something you just kind of naturally came to you, like, hey, this is the right way to do it, or the better way to do it, or is this just, was there a recommendation, or how'd you get to that?
Another really good question. I had a mentor who I share it in the book, but I've shared this over my military career and still beyond, that I met uh, pretty early into my military career, wound up becoming the most impactful and important mentor across the entire arc of my military career. And as I was going out to my first mid-level management position, he said to me, writing is a lost art. And I don't mean emails or texts. What I mean is sit down and handwrite messages to people. And so over time, I really framed that in a different way where I call it the baby's birthdays and big deals. Anybody inside my organization that has a baby, I want to know some details. If they're okay sharing. Yeah. How many inches long, how many pounds, what's the name? Do they have a full head of hair, or something that I could then give back, and I would write a note to the parents about, and just give them congratulations for the birth of their son, daughter. Share a couple of details. Uh, Birthdays, you have to figure out in your organization at what point do you not handwrite birthday cards to people. Again, using the Air Force Academy as an example, I can't write 3,000 birthday cards. I would just be writing cards
Mhm.
all the time and not getting anything else done. So I figured out where my cut line was, but I was still writing scores of cards a year, handwriting birthday cards. And then big deals were, did you graduate college? Did you earn some big award? Were you promoted? Did something happen in your life that's really cool? Maybe you got married, or, obviously babies is a separate category, but that was a way for me where I just wanted to know, and I would handwrite notes. And like people's pictures popping up at the all calls, they, they had no idea that I knew that somebody was reporting that back to me. But more importantly, they very much appreciated that they got a handwritten note from me. And it didn't have to be super long. It wasn't like I was writing, a big letter, but we had these little cards, and at that time I was a colonel, so it had an eagle on the top. I just wrote these cards and I sent them out, and I still do the same thing. In fact, just a couple of days ago, I sent one of my general officer note cards to a teammate at one of the organizations that I support, because she told me, hey, my daughter just got this big promotion in the U.S. Marine Corps. And I knew exactly what that meant and what that means to not just her as her mother, but to her as a professional. So I said, hey, would you mind sending me her address? I'm going to handwrite her a note. And so I sent that on Friday. And so I still do that today, but it was that mentor, Mr. Arthur Myers, who impressed upon me, take the time to write people and learn something, not just a, hey, have a great birthday, but learn something of personal note to them. Put that in that note that you're handwriting and send it to them. You will never necessarily get the praise, and that's okay. But in those off times that somebody will thank you for that, they will remember that, and it could be a game changer for them. And as I said a few minutes ago, I call it a moment that matters, and that just matters. Just it cost me a couple of minutes to write, but I had no idea how greatly impactful that's going to be. And then one quick story connected to that, a person that worked for me a number of years ago, her mom called me as she was getting ready to get promoted from captain to major in the Air Force. And I had met her mother when I had officiated her promotion to captain a number of years earlier. And she just reached out to me and said, hey, my daughter's getting promoted to this next promotion. I'm actually going to do the ceremony because her mom's a retired Air Force colonel. I'm going to do the ceremony. I know you're not going to be there, but she remembered when you had handwritten her a note, some specific occasion. Would you handwrite her
Wow.
a note on the occasion of her next promotion? Because she still talks about that note you wrote her years ago. Yeah, of course. I mean,
Wow.
of course I'm going to do that. So those little things really matter, and they're so intrinsic, right? People really appreciate that you took the time, you're invested. That shows a level of dedication different from using an AI generated email, right? You're actually taking the time to do it.
Yeah, I mean, making people feel like they matter, I think, is highly underrated these days. And it's the thing is with any of this kind of stuff is there's the impact is immeasurable in both good and bad ways. Meaning, like
Mhm.
sometimes it does nothing. Actually, most of the time, it probably does
Yeah.
nothing in the small term. But in the off chance it does something, it's very meaningful. Or in the long term, it has, I think, a very meaningful effect. And there's really no downside except for a little bit of time, like you're
Right.
talking about. But yeah,
I think that's
that's really
right. Most people go, oh, that was nice, and it will make no real difference. But that one time it makes a difference, how many other humans are going to be impacted by the one time it makes that difference? Because that one
exactly, yeah.
person then replicates that and recognizes that's a moment that matters. This person took the time to do this for me. I'm going to do that for others. I have no idea how many people replicated that practice, but you're exactly right. It didn't matter how many people replicated it. It mattered that I took the time to do it. And leadership is not about building this legacy around you, that you have this aura of the great man or woman. It's really more about, wow, that person took the time to do something of a personal nature. They're invested in me, and that can make a huge difference in your organization. I think it
Yeah,
made differences in my organizations.
I'm sure I did. I try to do things similar. I think where I struggle, and I guess I haven't gotten there yet, is the scalability of some of the things. But
Right.
I think because so one of the things I did when I took over as CEO of Kodak was
Mhm.
we had 110 people at the time. Was nearly a 30 to an hour, depending on the conversation,
Mhm.
meeting with each person.
Yes.
And I mean, if you add that up, that's, a lot of time, a lot of meetings, a
Mhm.
lot of prep time, a lot of reflecting time, a lot of time to coordinate schedules. And, I remember saying it to somebody that was going to do it, and they said, well, that's not scalable. And I'm like, that's okay. I can worry about that when that's a problem. I'm like, I mean, first of all, I'm not going to do it once a quarter. That would be impossible.
Right.
And if we're 1,000 people, then I'll worry about it then, right? And I'm like, it's just my first thing, because I want to talk to each person,
Mhm.
understand them, understand what makes them tick, what they need, how I can help them. And so, other things are like birthdays. I know I don't handwrite. I probably should. I have terrible handwriting, but I guess that's not the point. But I do try to, say happy birthday to every single person and happy anniversary and stuff. I will say that is somewhat challenged the scalability there. And so I'm trying to think of other ways to acknowledge people. I was sending gifts for a while for those things too, and personally, and that would take some time too. And I realized I can't do that, because each person has a birthday and a work anniversary, right? Twice per year, right? At that point, right? So 2 things per year. That's, 200 plus times of gifts and or whatever. And that is not not only not scalable, but hard to kind of keep up that thing. But I also think like, hey, I did it for a while. I did what I could. I'm trying to find ways to connect with people and make them feel like they matter. Hopefully it's working and somebody feels it, right? That's my goal.
No, I think that's exactly right. So scalability, when I was thinking about you're leading an organization of 3,000 humans, there's no practical way that I can write a birthday card to everybody like we talked about a few minutes ago. And so I just communicated with my leadership team. It said, here's why I'm asking for the birthday and month. I'm asking the year. Don't give me all that information. But here's where my cut line is. However, there is no cut line on babies or big deals. I'll figure out how to make that work. And sometimes people are just not comfortable sharing the information. That's okay. It was never a forced mechanism. It was simply, this is something I'm interested in doing. I'd be happy to do that. And interesting, we talked about my wife earlier, where she would run into people and they would tell her about, your husband wrote me this note when my child was born. Like, I had no idea. It showed up in my, I was at my desk or at my workplace, and wow, I had no idea he had done that. And that made all the difference because they made the connection. Whether or not they ever mentioned it to me, immaterial, but they did tell her that they knew that hey, your husband took the time to write this. Or she would learn, other things where I would write recommendations for people as they were looking for different opportunities and options. Not everybody, but same kind of thing is that if you ask me, I'll sit with you and I'll have a conversation with you. And if I feel good about that interview, then yeah, I'll write a recommendation for you. It's not automatic. I mean, if you ask me, I'm not going to write it. And there were times where I did turn people down, and I gave them good reason for that. I'm not comfortable writing a recommendation for these various reasons, or here are some things I recommend you work on, and then come back to me in the next cycle. And let's revisit that. And perhaps it'd be the right timing for me to write that recommendation. Perfect example of that is a young person asked me for a recommendation for a specific opportunity. And I sat down and interviewed the person, and I didn't think they were ready. And so I gave them that feedback. So it's not that I won't write your recommendation, but I can't in good conscience affix my signature to that recommendation, which I will write. You will not give me a pre-written and then I'll just sign it. That's not how I operate. But it's why we're having this conversation, because I want to make sure that you are ready for this opportunity, and somebody else can write that recommendation for you if you'd like. But I think I owe it to you. You're asking me. I shouldn't just automatically saying, yeah, I'll do that, and don't do any inquiry into that person. I mean, you and I as working professionals would never do that. Right?
Right.
No, it's our reputation that's on the line. So we wouldn't do that. But yeah, I mean, I just had to understand where my limits were. At some point I can't say yes to everything, and I can't write every human a note. But still that still precipitates because people know that these things are happening. The other part of this, and it's a very important piece, is consistency matters. So, if you start that for a period of time, yes, scaling is going to be a more challenging situation. And so provided that you are still consistent in the way that you think through that, or anyone, not, that's listening, that is going to matter, because if you do it once and you stop doing it, people will recognize that too. And they'll think that what you were attempting to do was ingratiate yourself to them, as opposed to this leader actually cares about me. And so that matters too. So if I sent you a birthday card last year and you're still on my team, you're going to get one next year if we're still working together, because that matters. So you're just like, oh, he just did it, once, and then I never heard from him again.
It's almost worse, right? It's like, did I do something wrong?
It is. Like, wait a minute, last year they sent me a birthday card, and this year we're still part of the same team. and they didn't send me a birthday card.
Yeah.
And so that was another thing where, I had to help. I need my staff to help me with that. So you got to track this for me. So I don't miss that, because that's an error
Yeah.
of omission as opposed to commission, but it matters to me, and it's going to matter to that human. You're exactly right. Like, what, did I upset him? Like last year I got this great card. This year I got nothing. Like, no.
Yeah. Well, I better get back on some of these. No, I mean, it's a good point. It's a very good point too. I guess I came out too hot, and now I got to figure out how to scale it back without, coming across inconsistent or ingratiating or what have you. So that's a good point. Is being I probably should have thought through, like, what is a way to do this that's sustainable, so that the person feels like it wasn't just a one-time thing.
Yeah. And also I think when you think about the scalability challenge, and I know you would do this, is just be open about it. So here, I attempted to do that when it was 100 or 100 plus people, it was manageable, and I could make that work. But now that we're at scope and scale X times above that, I simply can't do that anymore. And so, just understand that my intention, particularly in those early days as I was coming in, was just to make a connection with you. So I'm going to find other ways to connect with you. And one of the ways that I found was helpful in doing that with large scale organizations was this idea of positive inquiry, which I didn't coin. I talked to a psychologist who shared this with me about asking questions instead of the sort of perfunctory, "Hey, how's your day going?" And you get normally the same answer, "Oh, it's fine," or "It's good," or "Man, I'm just not having a good day," and that there's no necessarily follow on. But a different way to phrase that question, and I'm still working on this. I haven't perfected this, so I want to be clear about that. I'm still work in progress in this particular regard. But I recognized a better way to do that is to come up and say, "What's the best part of your day so far?"
Mm.
That's a very different framing as opposed to saying, "How's your day going?" Because you're inviting the person to give you a more thoughtful response as opposed to, "It's fine." That's typically what we get. But when you say, "What's the best part of your day?" I have to think for a second. Ooh, now it can go in a number of different ways. It could be, the best part of my day is this thing happened to me this morning. I had this great engagement with a client, and it blew my mind. It was wonderful. Okay, great. Now you just learn a little bit more from that human. Or they can say, "And I'm having a really challenging day." Oh, well, tell me a little bit about that. And obviously, as busy executives or leaders, you can't spend an hour in that conversation, but even just a couple of minutes of that kind of engagement, it's a game changer. Because that human will always remember the way that you engage them.
Mm.
Even if it's and again, an organization as large as I was leading at the Air Force Academy, that might be the only time I ever actually have a 2-minute conversation with that human. And I was deliberate about trying to make that connection so they walked away feeling that leader was actually interested in me, not just the perfunctory, salutation, "Hi, hello, have a good day." No, they actually engaged me in a different way. Again, I'm still working
That's
on
pretty
that.
cool.
I didn't get that right with every engagement I had, but being thoughtful about that and thinking through, that's a way that you can engage people. That's not a handwritten note, and that's not, the birthday gift and the anniversary gift, but it's still a moment that matters to that human, and you're engaging them in a different way. And
Oh,
they'll remember
absolutely.
that for sure.
Absolutely. I remember that. I think you mentioned that in your book, and then I already forgot it, but now I just remembered again. So I will try that, because I think it's a different way. You're right, because most people just say, "I'm good," whatever. And even if you actually want to know how they're doing, it's still the same question that you could also use when you don't really have time to find out how much, how well someone's doing, or you're asking the cashier, but you're not going to sit there and talk for an hour. You're just saying, "How are you?" Yeah. It's more of a hi than it is a question, right? So yeah, I hear you.
That's right. Mhm.
Let's, if you don't mind, I'd love to just pivot a little bit on
Sure.
the Space Force, because you were one of the original founders, if you will, of people brought in to kind of help stand it up, which is absolutely fascinating. And
Right.
I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person to say this, but it makes me think of that Steve Carell show, Space Force, on Netflix. I assume it's really different in real life, but
Exactly the same.
Yeah, yeah. What a cool concept though. And for you, I think you were the, let's see here, deputy chief human capital officer, deputy
Correct.
chief human capital officer,
Hmm.
which is a big deal. So you had to figure out how to bring in the right people,
Hmm.
get them motivated, to get them trained. That's a big deal. I mean, this is again, the military is an important thing. This isn't just a side project. So that seems like a big challenge. It's very focused on people. So what were I mean, and where would you even learn something like that, right? There's probably not a lot of books on building new branches of the military. So how did you approach that?
I actually, it's a really interesting thing because in those early days, I coined the phrase that we're a military startup. And so I
Mm,
started to think through it from a business IT startup concept. This is a highly technical, highly innovative organization, not at all dissimilar to building something in Silicon Valley or the I-5 corridor in along California, or I-95 for that matter, as you head north into New England and that high tech corridor, particularly around Boston and Cambridge. And so it was that sort of thinking. Let's do this. How do we find the best and brightest men and women? And there's a lot more to that story. We could spend hours talking about some of those dynamics, but that's how I was framing it. It's like we're a startup. And so you have to think like startup. You have to think about the fact you're going to be really lean at the beginning. We're only going to have a handful of humans who are going to be responsible for doing everything. And very much like a startup, we were fighting for funding and trying to get, it's different, right? These weren't angel investors, but working through that same kind of concept is we have to help people inside the Pentagon, inside the presidential administration, and across the river, as we love to say, in Congress, understand what we're trying to do here. Now, those authorities to do that all came through federal law, but there was a lot of that work. And so the
mhm.
dynamics to me were very similar to that. We need to think about it that way. If we approach it that way, recognize there's going to be a lot of late nights. We're probably going to be eating pizza and doing all those sorts of things that you sort of think about. But that's how we approached it. It's like we just have to figure this out. And oh, by the way, we have to move with blinding speed. We
Mm.
love in the U.S. military. We have these long, elaborate, what we call 5-year plans. We think through every possible scenario, and we build this really great project management plan out. And we detail it, and you have the milestones and all that sort of thing. And then Congress came back and said, well, the president signed this into law in December of 2019, and you only have 18 months to get to what we call initial operational capacity. So like a startup, it's like in 18 months, there needs to be a product coming out at the other end, whether it's a piece of software or hardware, whatever it is. There needs to be something that's in the marketplace. You need to be there in 18 months. So it changed everything. So now you just compressed that down significantly at the same time that I was person number 5. Uh,
Wow.
that that's it. There, I'm looking around the human resource area, and I'm the 5th person, and really the only other person that had a lot of human resource experience was my boss. So the 3 teammates we had who were great people, that's not their forte. That's not what they grew up with. So, asking them to build out policies and procedures and figure out all of the mechanics of what we were about to do, they were up for the work, but they didn't have that depth and breadth of experience that my boss and I had doing that sort of work. So I remember one day we were walking down the hall from the chief of staff's office. So in this case, chief of staff is the highest ranking military member in the Space Force, General Raymond, who wrote the foreword to my book. And my boss, we just stopped in the Pentagon, 17 and a half miles a quarter. It's not like we walk all of those every day, but walking back to the office, she just stopped and she said, well, these are all of the things that we need to do. And you list off whatever the number of things were that we had, hot in the fire at that point. And I remember looking at her and saying, well, who's we? It's just you and me. Like, how are we going to do this? So, it was really just using that mentality of recognizing we're a startup, and we have to be that way. We have to be hungry. We have to be hunkered into what we're doing and recognizing we're not going to have enough humans. We're not going to have enough resources, other resources around us, dollars and what have you, for some period of time. They obviously got better over
Mhm.
the intervening months, but in those early days, like there wasn't a whole lot of there, and we had everything, pretty much everything we had, including me, were borrowed assets. They were from somewhere else that were shifted over to help do that work. So it was a fascinating experience, and make. I'm sure somebody's going to write that book at some point. It may not be me, but it really is an interesting story. And one last thought, then I'll pause again, is there was no playbook. There was no manuscript I could go to. There was no book I could pull off the shelf. There was no game plan that somebody had drawn up that I could simply lay it out on my desk and say, oh, well, this is simple. We just do A, B, and C, and off we go. That's no. We were, and we like to say this in the military, we were flying the airplane while we were building it, or in this case, we were building the satellite. We were flying the satellite while we were building it, and that's what happened. Okay, one quick story about Space Force, the television show. I could not watch it. I got through maybe like the first few episodes, and I was like, "This is so campy," and it really was like Office Space in space. Like
Yeah.
this isn't working. But there's this great situation where Steve Carell called General Raymond before the first
Oh,
episode
really?
aired on Netflix, and they had
Wow.
a Zoom call about that. So when fast forward, General Raymond is getting ready to retire, and Steve Carell sent him a video about, hey, General Raymond, you had this great 40-year career, and you helped build the Space Force, and it was very funny. And at one point in the video, he says, well, my television show didn't get picked up for another season, so you're about to be out of work. I'm out of work right now, so if you want to get together and take a pottery class, like, we could do that. So it was
That's great.
really funny, and we showed that at our staff meeting. So you have all of the the top brass in the Air Force is in this room, and you get to watch it. It's maybe a 3 or 4 minute video, but it was really funny. But it was really touching because you know Steve Carell had made the connection that,
Yeah.
hey, we're doing something that's fun and lighthearted, and it's a comedy, but you are really doing something that's really important for the nation, and really for our allies and partners around the world as well, that we were working with as we were developing Space Force, and still are. But yeah, it was an amazing time. I didn't think so at the time. I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know how I'm going to survive this.
Right. Yeah, I bet.
But in retrospect, now 6 years later, after we started that work, it was a fascinating time, and I was just honored to be a part of it.
That's amazing. All right. There's a few, I would say, sort of signature questions that I've been asking people.
Yeah.
They're becoming signatures slowly, but I always find it interesting, that the responses I get, and very insightful and fascinating. So let me start with one. If you can go back in time, the time machine, to the younger version of before you were general, you said you were second lieutenant,
Well, yeah, and
right?
before
Or
that, I was
before that.
airman first class before I was even
Okay.
commissioned.
So then, or even earlier in
Yeah.
life, what is one piece of advice you would tell yourself?
I have actually thought a lot about this, and we talked a little bit about this. I would have been far away more inquisitive earlier in my life. It was, I think I had been in the military at that point probably 5 or 6 years before I really recognized that I needed to be a student. Because you get through high school, and then for those like you and me, go to college and go to graduate school and do all those things. He's like, I'm finishing those things up, and then I'm closing that chapter. No pun intended, without really recognizing, no, you need to be a student for life if you're going to be effective until the day you breathe your last. You need to be continually learning. You need to be engaged in that process. That's something I definitely would have told myself earlier. Just, you need to be intellectually curious forever. That never stops. Just as a professional, but as a person, I also had learned a little bit later on that intellectual stimulation is what's going to keep you young. That's what's going to keep you engaged.
Absolutely.
And right, there's a lot of medical research around that. If you're engaging the mind, and you're thinking through things that need critical thought, you can not perfect this, but you can help to stave off things like dementia and Alzheimer's because you're making sure your brain is staying highly engaged and you don't just become sedentary. So not just physically sedentary, but intellectually sedentary. So it's a way to just say intellectual curiosity. I would have invested more in that earlier in my life and career, for sure.
That's a good one. I've always asked a lot of questions. I probably annoy people with it, but it's my way of this is how I learn or I understand. And I always talk about the context and knowing the why of something. I mean, to me, that's how you learn something. I don't know. You can't just say this is how an airplane flies, but it's like, well, why? What is it that makes it lift, right? And
Right.
if you know that, then you can know what to do with that information or how to develop the next thing. That's very important for sure. So another question is for you, General, what is your personal definition of success?
Well, there's a number of ways to take this. So I think about it in terms of personal success was, and I don't mean to keep going back to the book, but I mentioned this in there that ending my military career with the same family I started with, that was really important. And look, it's not easy for people who've been married for a long time and raised kids and done all of that. It's challenging. It's hard. I would be better at that. Let me certainly say that. But that's a measure of success, is that I started and stopped with the same wife, and that was really important. So that's a successful measure. It's really much more about her than me, but that's important personally. Professionally, success is about accomplishing things that stimulate you and satisfy you, as opposed to thinking about, I must reach a station in life. So, for example, if I had not become a general, which, as I shared earlier, was like astounding to me, still doesn't necessarily feel right to say that. But if I had retired as a colonel, that would have been a fully successful career, and I would have left satisfied. And that's the thing, is that if you're chasing the titles, if you're chasing whatever it might be, the bigger house, the bigger boat, the whatever, there's always something else to chase. In fact, I was reading an article this morning about the fallacy of reaching the pinnacle of success. Is if you're continuing to stretch and say there's other things that I can do, that I can attain, not necessarily obtain, but attain, then that's what I think success is, that I'm bringing something useful to whomever I'm working with and for whatever purpose. So the various things that I do in life now, outside of my retired military career, that's what I'm looking for. Am I bringing value to the people around me? That's success. And all those other things, they're trappings. And I mean that word deliberately. So, that's a cautionary tale. We hear about people who are incredibly wealthy, who are the most miserable people on the planet. Well, because I don't think they've asked themselves the question you just asked me. What does success really look like for you? And what is meaningful is maybe a more important second level and indented question. What does meaning look like for you? Meaning for me is that people are satisfied with the work that I'm doing for them. That's success. The other stuff, it matters. I mean, you got to pay the bills and that sort of thing. But your meaning is not necessarily in the material. So that success is what I'm looking for at this stage in my life.
Very insightful. If you go on social media, though, it's you're taught the exact opposite, right? It's about flying in private jets and buying cars, whatever. And it's definitely a bad thing to teach our youth. Obviously, sometimes money comes with success,
of course,
professionally, right?
Right.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
No.
When you look at Elon Musk or somebody like that, they're the richest. He's the richest person in the world, but I think he's motivated by something else. And this is not a comment about political or anything. I'm just saying, clearly he's motivated by not just money, because he's got all the money already. So there are people who find motivation and or how they define potentially where they want to go in life by other things that are not just money and bags and shoes.
I think you're exactly spot on. And there's nothing wrong with being very wealthy and super successful and having the things. But your question is really more insightful than that. It's what is your measure of success? What is fulfilling for you? And are you finding it meaningful? I mean, I think like Steve Jobs, I don't know, I never met him. And obviously he's been passed for many years now. I don't think he was motivated by money. I could be wrong, right? Because I don't know him, but what you get from him and others was they're motivated by the things they're trying to actually accomplish, not necessarily the bigger
Yeah.
house and the bigger boat and what have you. And you know the story about how he got to the iPhone. He was motivated by that. The
Hmm.
fact that he made an insane amount of money along the way to get to the iPhone, and then after he launched it. But remember, what he talked about when he was on his deathbed. He didn't talk about money or homes or that sort of stuff. He talked about relationships and things that mattered, the meaningful things that people will remember after you're gone. I mean, I'm glad he figured that out. I think before he passed, but no, I think you're right. You can be incredibly wealthy and successful in that way, but are you really satisfied with what you're doing, and what is the meaning you're deriving from the work that you're doing, whatever it is, whatever your good or service is, whatever you do in life. Borrow from another multi-billionaire. Bill Gates figured out a number of years ago, at least publicly, this is what we understand, is that he realized, I have all of this enormous wealth, but what am I doing with it?
Hmm.
And that's why he spends so much time in sub-Saharan Africa and dealing with immunizations and mosquito netting and all the things that he's involved in. Whether we agree or disagree with, the politics of it, it's immaterial. He figured out that there's something more meaningful to do with all of this money that he could never possibly spend. Like,
Yeah,
right. So,
absolutely.
I think it's a really instructive question. And so for me, I'm finding in my own life, what's meaningful is that I want to do things that are satisfying to the people I'm working with and around, and having those connections. That's what's driving me.
Awesome. All right, another tradition which I think I've stolen from some other podcast on the internet is leaving a question for the next guest. Now, somebody left you a question, and that last guest was Miss Tia Thomas, and she was a VP in the FAA,
Mhm.
executive director. Actually, she was executive director of strategic workforce planning, which is kind of similar to some of
Mhm.
your stuff.
Mhm.
Had various executive roles. Her question to the next guest, who she did not know who it was, and I think this is an interesting question because it's something I think we all feel as leaders or just non-leaders, all humans, which is, but I think in the context of leadership, it stands out differently because people look to you differently. But how do you refuel when your tank is empty?
Oh, such a good question. And it's really important. In military context, we think about this in terms of what we call the four pillars of resiliency. And so the refueling, whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual, or mental, and that's really important to make sure you're fueling yourself. So for me, it's recognizing my own gas gauges. What you sleep when you need to sleep, eat when you need to eat, that sort of thing. I don't mean to make this sound like Forrest Gump. I'm hungry, I ate, and when I was tired, I slept. That sort of thing. For that, you remember the movie,
Yeah.
but it's recognizing your own gas gauges, and so for me, particularly when we were building the Space Force, I mean, I completely ignored all of my warning lights, all of them. And really important context here: we started building the Space Force 3 months before the global pandemic hit.
Oh
And
wow.
so all of those other things that I described that were challenging, we're also doing that in the midst of a once in a century event where we were dealing with all those additional complications. And so a lot of the ways that we would have done business, we couldn't do. We couldn't be together, because we, like everywhere else, we were limited in how many people could be inside the Pentagon at any one given point in time. So about 80% of the people that were typically in the building were not there on
Hmm.
any given day. So it was a very
Wow.
strange environment to be in. So to pay attention to those gas gauges and recognizing, hey, I need to go exercise. I need to make sure that I'm taking care of my body. I need to make sure that I'm doing mentally stimulative things like we talked about a few minutes ago. So reading and just doing other things. Recognize I have to take care of that spiritual component for me, whatever that looks like for you. For me, it's very specific. For others, maybe it's meditation or different ways of approaching that. But are you paying attention to those things? And then socially, particularly during the pandemic where we were not potting outside of our little enclave of close friends or family, that social connection matters too. And so for me, that's how I refuel. I'm thinking through the things that I know are going to recharge me, re-energize me, refuel me, and being mindful about that, being deliberate about that. And one of the ways that we describe that is a number of years ago, my wife said to me, "Hey, you got to stop burning at both ends. You are going to burn yourself out." But particularly when we were building the Space Force, because it was too easy to just work all the time. I mean, literally, like all the time. And she said, you got to set parameters. You have to have limits. And so we created what we call inside the sevens. And so between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., I was on. You could find me, you could work with me, you could call me, text me, email me, what have you. But outside of that window, if it's not an emergency situation, you're not going to find me. Now, I share with my boss, hey, if you call me at 9 p.m., I know there's a reason you're calling me. I'm going to pick up the phone. But it was providing some of those limitations to make sure that I gave myself permission to refuel. And that's okay. It's entirely necessary. As executives in particular, leaders at any level, if you're burned out, if you're running on empty all the time, you're not any good to yourself, nor are you any good to the team or teams you're leading. You're just not. And so that was just giving myself permission to refuel. But what a great question. It's really important for leaders to be.
It was good.
It was.
Yeah. I mean, we're humans. We're all humans, and
yeah.
I think sometimes you feel like, well, you still gotta be, superhuman, if you will. But it's okay to be human.
That's
we're all human, and it's kind of like what on the airplane when the oxygen mask drops. You also have to take a breath right first. Otherwise, you're gonna pass out. Yeah,
mm-hmm. That's right. Right.
Well, so then let me throw it back to you. Is there, as you think of other leaders that hopefully will be joining me in the future, mm-hmm. what is one question that you'd like me to ask?
And this is another one that I thought a lot about, is because people as leaders, particularly especially if you make it to the executive levels, people are thinking about legacy. And I don't think about legacy. So my question would be, what would be the most lasting legacy for you? Because people have asked me that question, and I think it's a really good one for leaders to answer. And answering it myself, I just say, it's not about me. Did I leave the people around me prepared to carry on after I'm gone? As opposed to, is my name on the building somewhere? I don't really care about that. So for me, that's a question I want to ask leaders, because it tells me a lot about the way they're thinking about things. How do you define legacy? What does that look like for you?
That's a great question. It's going to be a tough one for the next person. By the way, I'm curious. There's a new one that Jeff Planty, a mutual friend, had suggested. Is, now that you've gone through this and we're still going here, but is there somebody that comes to mind that you're like, they would love to come on the show and tell their story?
Let me think about that and get back to you. I mean, tons of people come to mind, but I want to find somebody who would be one that I know would do it, and two would be super interesting to talk to, and not just soft to, oh well, I know this military person. Like, that's easy.
Yeah.
But,
no,
that
works.
That might be interesting for you to talk with.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate your time. I think we could keep going for hours and hours. General Shawn Campbell, again, the book is out. I would highly recommend reading it. Even a person like me that can't read was able to read it. So I do recommend it. Appreciate your time, all your insights, and thank you. And hope to have you on again pretty soon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. It was a joy to be with you. I appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you.